Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Derrick Simpson. I'm a volunteer with Strong Towns Ottawa and with the Centertown Community Association. So today we have a meeting with Charles Marohn. He is the author of Strong Towns, the author of a new book, Escaping the Housing Trap, and the author of the book we discussed last week. Sorry, I'm going to mute
I'm
someone.
trying to find, there he is. I found him.
All right. Was that Glenn
I was
Geller?
like,
That is an Ottawa City Councilor. So,
well, I just muted him.
all
So,
right. So,
bam.
yeah, Charles is the author of Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, which we discussed last week. We had a great discussion on that. So today is our follow-up Q&A with Chuck. So I'm just going to get right into it. First question I have is, since you've released Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, have you seen an increased emphasis in road safety? Has anything
That's a
changed?
really, no, I mean, it is like the essential question, isn't it? Right? I mean, really, like that's it. Um, I'm going to say yes. I feel like you're asking me if there's a cause and effect from the book that we released to safety that we're seeing. And I think that that's maybe a little bit more amorphous. You know, we shortly after the book came out started on the crash analysis studio here at Strong Towns, and that's been our initiative to try to help local governments, local activists, technical professionals think about traffic safety differently. And we've certainly seen results from that. We've seen the conversation shift. We've seen places doing somewhat different things. We've seen a lot of success on the ground. I start to think like, wow, we're making big progress. And then I had a good friend of mine text me over the weekend saying that he was somewhere and gave a talk, and it was, about street safety and all that. And he was quoting the book and what have you. And he said everybody's mind was blown. They had never heard the term strode. These were engineers and other city staff. They had never heard the term strode. They were just shocked. They started to use it themselves. They were blown away. And it made me realize, like, wow, sometimes I feel like we've saturated this space and like the conversation can't happen without our terms and our way of looking at things being part of it. And then I realized that no, there's a lot of stuff going on at city halls all over the place where we've just not penetrated the conversation yet. So I'm going to give us if the goal is to get to 10 and we started with the book at 1, I'm going to say we're at like 2 or 2.5. I think we have a long ways to go yet, but
Well,
let's keep going.
it's progress. I mean, I know we've had the word strode used in Ottawa City Hall, so we're going
Yeah.
slowly, but we're going somewhere.
Yeah, that makes me
Um,
happy. I've heard that too. So,
so next question I have for you, this is a quote from your book, and it's based on a highway project in the US. You say, what they were doing is what engineers, planners, and project advocates all over the country do when going after state and federal funding for their project. They create propaganda. This is how the system
mhm.
works, and everyone involved knows, understands, and accepts it. So my question is, how can community groups like Strong Towns Ottawa fight against or change the narrative on the propaganda?
I think we have to get to what we covet, right? What do we desire? Um, I remember the first time I came face to face with one of these. I was in a meeting, and I knew going in that this was a bad project. Um, I wasn't working for the engineering firm that was doing the work, but I was talking to the engineer, and he knew it was a bad project. We both knew, like this is a dumb project. This should not go anywhere. And the meeting was to hear from the economic development advisor, and they were going to be there with basically the adjunct or the colleague of our state rep or our federal representative. So our representative in Congress, this was a congressman's office, was going to be there. And I like, this is going to be a disaster of a meeting. And I showed up, and they passed out the big propaganda sheet, and it's like, hey, this has an 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. And I'm like, that's impossible. Like, there's no way that is. And they passed it out, and there were like cheers, like people erupted, like, this is incredible, this is great, we're so happy, like, you did a wonderful job. And I remember this like exaltation going through the group, because it was a lot of elected officials and appointed staff and people who were working on the project and all that. And it was reflecting on that moment later, after reading like Thinking Fast and Slow and some other books about just cognitive science, I realized that the people in the room wanted to believe that. And because they wanted to believe it, they believed it, right? It wasn't, they didn't believe it because it was true. It was propaganda. It was actually, if you scratch the surface a little bit, the underlying math like made no sense. And it was a bunch of assumptions that I think you could arguably make, but on really, really flimsy ground. And you had to, like I say in the book, you had to ignore a whole bunch of other things that were also obvious. You were kind of cherry picking the things that you wanted to believe. But I realized that if people want to believe it, they will believe it, and someone will put it forth with credibility. And so to me, as advocates or as city council members or as technical staff or as, just concerned citizens in a community who want to see good decisions be made, we have to first confront the fact that we often covet transportation money. We often covet the big project. We often covet the ribbon cutting. We often covet the kind of false progress that comes from doing something really big. And if we can confront like that's our own failing and weakness, I think some of these other things become easier to talk about and easier to confront. But if we can't, you can go to Shreveport, which is where that chapter is about, and talk to them about the I-49 intercity corridor connection. And there's a whole group of people who don't want to hear any argument that would, point out how their economic study is flawed and how their traffic assumptions are flawed and how 3,600 cars a day is not worth $1 billion of expenditure. I mean, there's a whole litany of things, and they don't want to hear it. There's a book written by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And I think Jonathan Haidt is one of the most brilliant, insightful people of our time. He's a psychologist, and he talks about the human brain working more like a press secretary than a rational, we're taught that humans are rational. And by a press secretary, he's suggesting that it's not that your brain will lie to you. It's not that your brain will just tell you things that flat out aren't true. But if your heart and gut wants to believe something, your press secretary will like explain it to you in a way that makes sense to you. You want to believe it. And I think if we recognize that about ourselves, we can come a lot closer to dealing with this conundrum we put ourselves in. Does that make sense, Derrick?
Yeah, it doesn't sound simple or inspire hope.
It doesn't.
I
No.
appreciate the honesty.
I wish there was an easy policy thing.
Yeah.
The funny thing is like the deeper you get into this, the more inadequate I feel, because I'm an engineer, I'm a planner, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not, I don't. Group behavior is something that I have studied to try to understand why we do these things. But I mean, it's a whole nother branch of science and understanding, really.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Mhm.
So final question for me. This was submitted by Kleber on X, if that's what you want to call it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
what is your vision of consultation for public municipal projects, and how much individual or local rights should weigh in on such projects?
So what's my vision for how much the public should be consulted?
Yeah.
So it's a meaty question. There's a concept called subsidiarity. And I'm a Catholic. It actually comes from Catholic teaching, but I've seen it show up in a lot of other places. So I think I can talk about it without the overarching notion of Catholicism. The idea is that we it is important what decision is made, but it's also really, really important who makes the decision. I wrote about this actually in my first book, and I said the idea of backyard chickens, it would be absurd if Congress legislated on backyard chickens. It would just be absurd. Like it wouldn't make any sense. And in your context, if the provincial government said, here's the rule on backyard chickens, it would be kind of silly, because backyard chickens is really like the most localized of things. If you and your surrounding neighbors kind of all agree on what should happen with backyard chickens, it really doesn't have any effect on someone 2 blocks over. It's really a very localized thing. And so if you're making a decision on backyard chickens, it should really be a decision that is brought down to the level of a block. And the idea is that the next level up, if that's the local government, if that's the neighborhood association, whatever it is, becomes like a mediator, a facilitator, an arbitrator, someone who helps you make that decision. But they can't take that decision away from you. It's not in their power to make, it's in your power to make it at that block level. Ideally, from a transportation standpoint, we spend the next 3 decades doing much more bottom up, much more local, hyper localized block level types of transportation projects. And in that case, to me, the consultation paradigm shifts completely. It's really less about sitting in a meeting and asking people what they want and voting up and down and having sticker charts on the walls and all this kind of fancy public engagement stuff. It doesn't look like public hearings at all. It looks like that 4-step process, the humble observation, doing the next smallest thing, repeating it over and over again. And in that case, the public opinion, the public consultation becomes more just like user reviews, right? Like how are you using this? Are you struggling? Is it difficult? If it is, like, we're going to go out and do something. It's a lot more like on the ground customer service. If we're building like a regional transit line, or we're building some, inner city kind of thing, I think we, particularly in the US, I can't really speak with a lot of intimacy about how you do it in Canada, but I know in the US, we've created a system that in a lot of ways is performative in terms of the amount of input, but not real substantive in terms of its ability to affect the outcome. And I personally would do away with a lot of those projects. And so I would do away with the need to have that process. I'm not a big fan of, I was talking to someone last week about this because, we celebrate Jane Jacobs, and it was Jane Jacobs' birthday this weekend. And so we had, around the country, there's people talking about Jane Jacobs in very beautiful ways and very deservingly so. Jane Jacobs did a lot of her advocacy and a lot of the work that she's most famous for in a period of time before the environmental movement. I mean, as part of the environmental movement, but really before the big wins of the environmental movement. So before public hearings, before environmental reviews, before all these things that we use today, largely to like kill and slow down projects. And I don't think that that is the right legacy for her. I think she was much more, if you listen to her, not about how do we create a really cumbersome process for all worthy projects to go through, but how do we make more of what we do, almost all of what we do, very bottom up, and kind of take our cues from the humans living in those places. So I feel like the question is asking me, in the current paradigm where public opinion, public process and surveys kind of drags things out and makes it not work, what would you do? And I'm like, I don't like the projects that go through there. I would pick different projects. If we're not going to pick different projects, I'm really not motivated by trying to streamline the current delivery process for bad projects, even
Yeah,
if some good
yeah,
projects get caught in that from time to time.
yeah. I definitely see what you mean. In Ottawa, I know we definitely hear that things seem performative a lot of the time. So it seems like there's a lot of similarities to the US.
Yeah. It's the performative part. I mean, I get it, but it is I've been on both sides of this. And I recognize that when I submit a comment, that might be read, but it's not going to affect like the outcome. And I've been on the other side where I've received the comments and I'm like, oh, that's a worthy comment. Next. And it's not that the players in the system are bad or evil or don't care or whatever. It's just that that's not what they're being asked to do. They're being asked to deliver a project.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we'll open it up to the floor to questions. So I see Elaine McGregor has her hand up. So we'll start with you, Elaine.
Yeah, I'm interested to talk about how do we distinguish between the needs of a larger area and the needs of of the local people. I mean, for example, what if someone says that, yeah, we need a bike lane through here, and then the other person says, well, yes, but I don't like your design. Or I'm going to give you another very recent example, which doesn't affect me personally, but which is, but I thought was very interesting, where there was a proposal for a roundabout on Jeanne d'Arc in the eastern part of Ottawa, which would would basically allow buses to turn around more easily on that roundabout. But the people who lived there didn't like the design of the roundabout for various reasons thereabout. How does one handle this? Does one need to distinguish between, for example, the need for some sort of project versus the actual the specific design of that project, or or in the case of the roundabout, do we need to take the entire discussion to the committee, the population who live there, and say, okay, if you don't want a roundabout, what do you want? Because we still have to turn around these buses. What's the best way of handling that sort of thing?
It's a really good question. And I don't know if there is a universal truth to that. I don't know there's a universal answer. I think going back to this idea of subsidiarity, if we start with the bike lane, the decision to have a regional bike lane is one that should be made regionally. It's not one that like a local block level people can have a veto over the bike lane for the entire region. That being said, I think at the block level, we can take into consideration one design over another that would impact it. But the idea of like one design being we have the bike lane and the other design being we don't have the bike lane and the entire regional thing is in a sense nullified or killed. To me, those are not options on the table. If we're going to make the bike lane like it's going to be protected here versus unprotected, or it's going to be in this configuration versus this configuration, I think we can have those conversations at the block level and be very respectful of people there. But I don't think any block level input should be able to kill a regional bike lane. That's the subsidiarity concept. The roundabout one is very odd to me, and I'm a little bit I was going to say I'm a little bit triggered by it. Let me give you my gut reaction and then say like I don't have enough information. I don't know, but I'll give you some like guidelines. I do know that engineers tend to over-engineer roundabouts here in North America. I also know that from a transportation standpoint, we tend to over-engineer things like turnarounds and all that. So if this were done like directly in front of my house and I looked out and I'm like, this is vastly over-engineered, even though the concept might be good and we might need to be able to turn a bus around and there might be some like really rational reasons for why we did that. I would probably have I'm just going off of what I have seen. I probably have some very reasonable pushback on that because again, we do tend to over-engineer these things in a big way. That being said, I think if the idea is here is our regional bus network, and as part of this regional bus network, we need to be able to turn things around at this end of it. I think the question then becomes, what is the best, most respectful way to do that? And again, you're not in a position where you're vetoing, like there's no turnaround here, but you do get maybe some localized bottom-up say on the exact configuration and what it would look like in that. But you still have to accommodate that thing. Does that make sense? I feel like if we were on the ground looking at it, I could maybe give you some more nuanced feedback, but that's as a general principle.
That's a good way. That is a good nuance for it. That's the kind of thing I was sort of thinking would be the logical way of doing it.
Thank you, Elaine. It's very nice to meet you.
All right.
Go ahead, Derrick.
Up next, Marco.
Hi, thank you for taking the time today. So my question is, how do you respond to the concerns of people who complain about like a lot of the short-term impacts that you see from things like road diets or not increasing road widths in the first place? For instance, like a lot of bike lanes, people will say like, "Oh, there's barely any people using this. So, like, why would we build more of this stuff?" When I think most people who are kind of in the uh, urbanist mindset understand that like it takes a long time to fully change the kind of the ways that people move about in their city, and so it's not as simple as just adding in one bike lane or doing one single road diet. So I guess how do you convince the people that say like, oh, well, this is going to make my short-term impact on my commute or whatever worse, and so therefore I don't want to do any of this stuff? Because I think that's probably the biggest pushback I hear a lot of the time for any of these alternative ways of going about transportation.
Marco, I want to turn that around 180 degrees, if it's okay. Let me try
Yeah.
to answer it in my way, and then you can tell me where I've come up short. I don't, again, I'll go back to what I said about Thinking Fast and Slow and Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. I don't think that you can get someone to believe something they don't want to believe. And I actually think that there are rational reasons why someone who's a commuter would look and say, okay, you're taking out a lane, you're adding bikes, you're forcing me to drive slower. This is going to make my life worse. I don't agree with that. Like, I'm not suggesting that that is the correct interpretation, but I am saying that that is an easy conclusion for them to make. They're going to make that conclusion, and there's no like magical incantation or study you can give them or thing you can do that will say, oh, okay, well, that, the next time I'm delayed on my commute, which I inevitably will be because it's a commute and commutes always have delays, I'm not going to blame the bike lane. I'm not going to blame the thing I don't like. I feel like that is a standard. If you're trying to solve that question, I think you're setting yourself up to fail and to fail miserably. The way I would look at it is this, and you made the observation or the contention that building a bike network takes a lot of time. And you said something along the lines of, we may build pieces of infrastructure that aren't well used. And that's part of the deal, because eventually when we build out the network, that will be used. And I hear you. I hear where you're coming from. I think that that is bad strategy, and I think that's bad marketing. Not on your behalf. I see every place doing this, but I mean, you make a huge burden for yourself when you proceed in that way. Let me give you two ways to think about building out a bike network. Option number one, and this is the most common way, is we're committed to bikes. We're committed to biking. Every time we do a new project, we're going to have biking be part of that. So if we go out and we do a project over here and it's bringing in federal money, or we're doing whatever, we're just going to add biking infrastructure to that because that's our new standard. That's what we're going to do everywhere. The benefits of that is you build out the network as you go. The downside of that is you will have a lot of parts of the network that have no biking, like have very little biking, have very little, not disproportionate to the investment that you've made. You also end up in a situation where your bike network is kind of dependent on your auto network, even though I think the two are not well aligned with each other. You also have the downside of the marketing problem, which is now you're messing with my commute, right or wrong, whether that analysis is, and I can point to the bike lane and I don't like it. Here's a second way to build out a bike network. And I've seen places go down this path, and I think they're far more successful, far more quickly. The way you do is you start with where people are biking right now. And you use the 4-step process that we've outlined. You say, where are people biking right now? And where is that difficult? And then you go out and you do the next smallest thing you can to improve that difficulty. So this crossing here is particularly hard. We're not going to fix that. It's not going to be fixed for perfect for good, but we can make it like a little bit easier to do. Imagine what that would be. You've got a difficult crossing. Okay, it'd be nice to have a bridge over the top of this road, but we don't have $5 million to do that. So maybe we can time the lights a little bit differently so someone doesn't have to sit in the cold or the rain on their bike. If they come up and hit the button, they can get across, 30 seconds quicker. those things go a long ways to making it easier to bike, and they don't cost anything. What's the next little thing we can do, and the next little thing we can do, and how do we iterate like that? And what you find when you focus bottom up like that on where people are struggling right now, there's always the next marginal person who would like to bike, but it's just a little bit too difficult for them, or they're having a little bit of struggle. So if you make it, say, on a scale of 1 to 100, if it's 1 is super hard and 100 is super easy, if right now you're sitting at like 5 or 6, if you make it like 7 or 8, you still don't have like a great biking city. But there's just a little few more people who will actually go bike now because look at, you just made that a little bit easier. Then you're starting to build a culture of people biking. So now you want to go from 8 to 9 and 10. Well, you could do that incrementally too, and more people will show up. Each time you make it a little bit better, you're basically building your constituency of people who bike. So the next time that guy shows up and says, I don't want this project that's going to take out a lane, I don't want this project that's going to add a bike lane, you're not there pointing at a plan saying, I have this abstract plan that we all agreed to that we're going to do. You're pointing to 200 people who bike and who are going to use that every day. And you can say, like, listen to these people. Like, I get that your commute might be impacted by 10 seconds, but these people here all bike this every day, and it's really dangerous now, and this is going to make it way better for them. And by the way, they shop here and they live here, and this will improve their property value and them. So you building your constituency. The way to get more biking infrastructure is to have a culture of biking and walking. And I think the strategy that I would use is to build that culture bottom up. Does that make sense, Marco? I feel like I didn't answer your question directly, but I answered it in my way.
I appreciate it. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, we are an urbanism book club, so we only read urbanism books, but Chuck has mentioned this twice, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh yeah.
A very good book. I would highly recommend it to anyone.
I'm glad you have a copy, Derrick.
Yes,
It is
I really like it. It's very good.
it is it's one of the best books I've ever read. It is really, really fantastic.
Yeah. So up next, we'll go to Jen.
There, sorry, I'm unmuted. Thanks for being here, Chuck, tonight. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Jen, say your
so
last name.
It's Gautreaux. Well,
Okay, beautiful.
In French, it's Gautreaux, but that's anyways. So I have a question about your 4-step process. I'm really interested in grassroots, boots on the ground change and how to do that. And so I really appreciate your 4-step process. Do you have any examples? And I think you may not want this to happen, given what you just said a few minutes ago about your hatred of processes sort of dragging everything down.
Okay.
But I'm just wondering, have you seen sort of a formalized framework in place that is across cities for that kind of change?
Yes.
Or does it make it too wieldy? Oh, so you do. Okay. So you have seen it. Okay.
I have a Canadian example. That's
Oh,
amazing.
great.
So we did a year-long engagement with Medicine Hat in Alberta. And if any of you are going to Cincinnati next week for our national gathering, you're going to hear a bit from the Medicine Hat people. They're some of the most genius, brilliant people I've ever worked with. And I think their genius starts with their humility, right? They really, really are open to the limits of their own knowledge and learning from the people in the community. And so they have broadly embraced the 4-step approach to the point where they've created an internal worksheet. And when they are coming to the council with something, they actually have this worksheet filled out where they're like, here's the problem we're dealing with. Here's the struggle. Here's the next smallest thing we can do. This is not going to solve it. But it's going to give us information and feedback on what the next step is. The council is actually, in a very kind of beautiful way, said, how do I put this? Because they didn't say it exactly like this, but I'm going to say it in my way, and then I'll try to maybe say it the way they said it. We're not going to beat you up as a staff for not solving problems. We're going to protect you and essentially give you the room to try things out and figure what works, because we want better results And we know that that means trying things that are small and bottom up that may not instantly work or may not have like a lot of gratification right away. It might be like, we're going to try this and that didn't work. So, but it's a small thing. So we'll something else and try something else until we figure out what works. They have told their staff that is what we want to see. And we're willing to take the trade-off of that, which is we are going to have a messier process, but we're going to get better results. So I want to say on Medicine Hat's website now, they actually have some of this stuff you can download.
Okay.
But Medicine
Great.
Hat is the place that I would point to as being
Okay.
one of the leaders in North America of implementing this
And this is-
citywide at scale
this is through the
throughout all
city?
departments. Yeah,
So
throughout
this is
all
a formal
departments.
program through the city. Okay,
It
great.
is. Yep.
Awesome.
And
Thanks so
I
much.
mean,
Appreciate it.
understand that they're not I feel like there's a little bit of tension when you say, you know, through the city, there's a little bit of tension because the city does a lot of top down things too. It's hard for the city to work bottom up. I think part of the city being able to work bottom up is that agreement that they have between the elected officials and the staff. And the agreement is, as staff, we're not going to come in here and pretend we know the answer, because when we come in here and pretend we know the answer, it has 7 figures behind it. Like, we can do this and we can fix this, but it's going to be $10 million. Instead, we're going to come up with, here's the next smallest thing we can do. And that will be really budget friendly, but it's not guaranteed success. We're trying things. We're trying to figure it out. But if we can do that and do it for 10,000 or do it for 15,000, we can figure things out and then scale them up. And the council has asked for that and the staff is delivering that. So no big top down, like the 4-step process and top down are the opposite of each other, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And there is a tension there in City Hall because voters and taxpayers and other people want solutions to problems, even if they're big and dumb and clunky and don't actually work. And this
sure.
has required a deep community conversation. I
Mhm.
mean, we did this year-long community action lab with them, which is a lot of community dialogue. It requires this deep conversation to give them the room to act in this way. Does that make
Great,
sense?
thank you so much. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, up next, Patrick.
All right, Chuck, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing your time with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for
I
reading
have
the
a-
book and having a whole book club on it. I mean, this is fantastic. I'm really, really grateful.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't claim to be fully done the book yet, but over halfway through, a little bit behind on the schedule here. My question's regarding hierarchical road networks versus, like, well, I guess a grid formation, or
Yeah.
what you may refer to as roads and streets. So to set a bit of context, I live in an area just east of downtown that is a grid network. And there's a couple, I guess, what you call major arterials near us, but a lot of people tend to cut through on these side streets. Just the other day, I was overtaken on a single lane road in the rain where there was a pedestrian going in the sidewalk. So it was not a very good situation. But I find, and I believe you mentioned this in the book, but don't quote me on this. But that basically grid networks handle this type of traffic, or I guess disperse it better, as opposed to flooding the one main road. But from the perspective of a resident, I would prefer to have that traffic on one main road so that our side streets, are quieter for children. People can bike, and maybe throw some modal filters in there to allow people on foot and bike access to other areas. So I'm kind of just wondering how this contrasts with the negatives of the hierarchical road network, as opposed to leaving the grid open for all users at all times. Thank you.
It's a great question, and it's a very human question. Let me pose 2 extremes, which you were not, but let me do it to frame the conversation. In one approach, we have highways with cul-de-sacs off of them, right? Everybody gets their own private area. There isn't through traffic. There isn't high levels of traffic. But then you have all the congestion that comes from trying to get on the highway when you leave. This is a really bad experience for drivers. It's a really inefficient use of public dollars, but it does provide the kind of cul-de-sac privacy that people often want when you frame it in terms of like, how many vehicles do you want going through your neighborhood? The other extreme would be just a completely gridded system where every street can just turn into every other street. There's no through roads. There's no kind of fast moving traffic. And everybody just kind of, if we want to put it in a negative context, suffers with a little bit of traffic. This would be from a flow standpoint, from a traffic standpoint, more efficient. But as opposed to, and contrasted to a cul-de-sac, you would have traffic in front of your street, in front of your house, in front of where the kids play, in front of where people are walking and biking. And that would be a stress. If we think about those two extremes, I want to point something out. And that is that our system right now is very, very sensitive to the things that are represented in that first option. So we are very sensitive to traffic flow. We're very sensitive to congestion and having to wait. We kind of respond to that in a very rote kind of way. And as a way to overcome that and kind of compensate for that nastiness, we give people exclusive private space where they will have very few cars. I can make an argument that financially that is ruinous. And that's what my first book was basically that argument. Like, that is an option that's on the table in a fantasy world of finance. It's not a real world option. In the real world, you have to actually make compromises and work things out and make them work well. But it is the option that we have pursued largely in this endless money kind of world that we have pretended we've lived in since the end of World War II. I think that world is coming to an end. I think that our ability to, not only are the costs of overcoming each increment like a Richter scale, like they grow by tenfold each time we go out a little bit further, but the revenue goes way, way down. I think we've outgrown our capacity to continue to do this. And so we're going to be forced to do something else. And the question that I grapple with is like, what does that something else look like? I respect the idea that if we take your typical city street and we run a lot of cars through it, that it becomes a miserable place. The question that I would pose back to you, or the nuance that I would provide is it a miserable place because of the volume of traffic? Or is it a miserable place because of the geometry of that street and the way it accommodates fast flowing traffic? I think it's more the latter. I have seen streets that can accommodate a lot of vehicles, but at very low kind of friendly neighborhood speeds where you don't even have like an auditory problem, like it's almost like quiet. And even though you are running what would be a higher volume of traffic than a typical city street, it is not offensive in any way. It feels very safe. It feels very comfortable. I look at the street outside my office, which is very, very low traffic. I mean, I'm going to guess 200, 300 cars a day, but everyone that comes through there is driving really fast because the street is excessively wide. It is like bizarrely wide. And so every car poses a huge danger. Obviously, if we slow down and diffuse traffic more, you're going to have a transition period where your over-engineered streets are still kind of accommodating fast traffic. I think we can focus on intersections and slowing things down there. And so you kind of limit, in a sense, the kinetic potential, the ultimate kinetic energy of that street, you know, when you slow people down at the junctions. But ultimately, we can't afford this first option. We're going to be forced to look at our streets differently. We're going to be forced to diffuse that traffic over a broader area. And I think we do that at low speeds. You'll find that the problem you expressed, where you're getting aggressive driving in an area where people are biking and walking, just will not be the thing. Let me put it this way. When we don't struggle with the financial part, we tolerate a lot of the other stuff. I think when we come face to face with the financial part, we have to work out the other stuff. And what I'm suggesting is that you actually need to work out the conflict that you're identifying. You can't just slough it off onto someone else.
Awesome.
Alrighty.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks,
All right.
Patrick.
Next up, we'll go to Logan.
Hi there, Chuck.
Hey,
So my
Logan.
question comes out of a recent podcast that you did talking about YIMBYism and some
Yeah.
of the pitfalls that come with the build, build, build mindset. And here in Canada, there's been a lot of promises from all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, to dedicate a lot of money to building houses, and specifically tying up that money to targets to meet certain minimums of houses built in a year, etc. So, and Strong Towns has had a number of good graphics kind of showing the ideal world of a gradual development pattern that sort of fits neighborhoods on it as needed, versus sort of a rapid development where a bunch of stuff gets paved over, a bunch of new stuff gets built. So over the next couple of years, there's a lot of money coming from all levels of government into the idea that we want to build as much as possible as fast as we can. How do we as Strong Town members and Strong Town supporters approach that dichotomy and sort of still advocate for development that fits the neighborhood, fits our cities, actually hits the desires and needs of the communities that they're being built in, whilst not being NIMBYs and not trying to prevent projects from going through? So that's my question.
It's a really good question. I don't know as I have a satisfactory answer. And I'm a little bit frustrated and angry with what Canada's doing right now. Medicine Hat worked out what I thought was a genius grant application to do bottom-up housing work. Edmonton did similar. They both had what I would call Strong Town's approach to housing, which was very much about thickening up existing neighborhoods, building the type of housing that I've been out now on the book tour trail talking about for the last few weeks, converting 4-bedroom homes into 3-bedroom homes with an accessory apartment, adding backyard cottages, building starter homes on vacant lots. These are strategies that we can do at scale that will provide a ton of housing and really change price points quite substantially. Medicine Hat provided a grant application to do that. I don't know who that was made out to, but it was part of this big initiative that's going on right now in Canada for housing. Edmonton did the same thing. Both of theirs got rejected. The one that I'm familiar with that got accepted was Calgary. And Calgary is building, they basically funded them buying down mortgages on single family homes on cul-de-sacs out in the middle of nowhere in Calgary. And it is essentially subsidizing the worst style of development, the style of development that's going to make Calgary go broke even faster than they are now. This is bad for Canada. It's bad for Alberta. It's bad for Calgary. And I think there's a huge opportunity missed. If you all are getting similar money to do similar projects, my gut reaction is that I'm really sad about this. I don't know how when here in the United States, when the federal government decides it's going to fund something, it's going to fund it at scale, it kind of becomes like the King Kong in the room. And like, you can get punched by King Kong, but you really can't stop him as an individual or even as a group. It's really, really hard to do. I wish I had a better answer for that. I feel like your federal program is really messing up a lot of things right now. I shared this article. It says Canada spending 70% of its forecast deficit to prop up mortgages. If you read this article, I mean, your federal government is spending a lot of money to allow people to pay more money for housing. And it is making housing less affordable for everyone. This is not any different than what we're doing here in the United States. I think yours is just a little bit more aggressive right now than what we've even been. You all sat out the 2001 to 2008 housing bubble, but you've made up for it since then. and your housing appreciation has been crazier than ours. Your financialization of your housing market has been crazier than ours. And it makes me really sad that such prudent, thoughtful people who, like I said, avoided the craziness of the 2000 to 2008 bubble, have from the top down, like embarked on kind of the most reckless financialization of housing, even more so than we have. So I don't know. I mean, your question was, how do we as strong towns advocates stop this? And I'll say this, and this is going to be very dissatisfying, but there are times when you look at an addict and you're like, you have to hit rock bottom, like I can't help you. And there's a part of your policy that is that. I think what you can do positively is actually start to implement your own local bottom-up approach. I mean, I think we go around and talk about three things that localities can do. The first one is code reform, make it easier to build the types of units that you need, these bottom-up smaller units. Second, create an ecosystem of incremental developers, actually create a pool of people who are out there doing this work, not doing the big projects out on the edge, but actually like the incremental developers, train them in, get them connected to each other, support them. And then the third is to localize the finance of those entry-level units. And there's a lot of strategies that cities can use to do that. This plan by the federal government is the antithesis of all that. And I don't know what to do, but say, try to weather that storm and get something else going, because at some point in the future, you're all going to need that something else. And if you can credibly deliver it in a small amount, when the time is there, you can scale that up and do it in a larger amount. I'm sorry, Marco. I wish I had an easier answer to that one.
All right. Yeah, that's a tough issue for sure. So
It is tough.
I want to give everyone who wants to a chance to ask a question. So next we will go to Toon.
Hi there. My name's Tone Dreesen. I'm an architect here in Ottawa, and I mean, I don't necessarily agree with all the things that you just said, but I certainly give good food for thought. I got sort of two questions,
Tone, you
kind of
can't,
interrelated.
You're required to agree with everything I say because it's my Zoom.
Oh, okay, no problem. Two interrelated questions. I guess my first is relating to your thoughts on congestion charges, in particular congestion charges to cross certain boundaries, whether that's London, London, UK has them in sort of the core area. In Ottawa, if you had a congestion charge to enter the city limits, and then another congestion charge to cross the green belt. And then secondly, how congestion charges could help fund things like transit, or fund the construction of active transportation, or could help fund transit projects that would sort of work in parallel. So there's a bit of a demand pricing associated with it, that the higher the demand on transit, the higher the congestion charges will go, until there's sort of a happy medium between the two. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
You're proposing an interesting feedback loop. Let me deal with the first question first, because I feel like you want to intellectually separate them too. So let me do that. What do I think about congestion charges? I fly a lot. I'm doing a book tour now, and I fly a lot. And guess what? If you fly during prime business hours, you pay more than if you fly red eyes and off hours. Everybody who flies accepts that trade-off, that there is, in a sense, a congestion charge for using the airline network at peak times. Nobody has a problem with this. Nobody is frustrated by this. Nobody thinks this is like anti-capitalism or anti-market or whatever. As a thought exercise, the idea that we would not have this on major pieces of infrastructure, to me, is you're just begging for suboptimal networks. I mean, if you're trying to optimize something, that is what you would do. You would have congestion charges and you would use it in that way. You did an interesting connection, which is, if we do A, could we fund B? And I always get a little bit leery about that. It brings me back to, like, the way we sell cigarette taxes here in the US. Um, if we tax cigarettes and alcohol more, we can fund schools. And you're like, okay, I don't want people drinking and smoking, so go ahead and have those cigarettes. And I really like schools, so let's do that. And then you wind up with this like weird conundrum. We have this with the lottery here too, where like you want people to do things that are self-destructive because it helps fund the things that you like. So to me, you went a little step beyond that, which I thought was really smart, where you said, well, there's an optimum level where if we fund the alternatives to driving and we fund that through congestion pricing, we can find like an equilibrium between the two. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. That would not be my preferred way of doing it, because I think that a lot of the best, certainly the best biking and walking infrastructure stands on its own. It doesn't need a separate funding source. It literally pays for itself far more than automobile infrastructure. It actually, will result in a higher tax base, a high return on investment. I mean, those are the best projects. If we do transit right, a lot of transit projects have similar financing, internal feedback loops where they actually create the development scenario that reinforces the value that you're creating. My fear of connecting the two would be that you use your transit investments primarily to service commuters, which to me, those are the lowest returning, least valuable transit investments that we could make, is to basically like reinforce the commuter model. The best transit investments we can make is to connect neighborhoods and make it easier to live in a place with one car per family or with no cars per family. When we can do that, when we can actually make that a choice that people make, because the transit is good enough to do that, you utterly transform places. New York, London are places where it is inconvenient to own a car. And so you can get away with congestion pricing because it's actually like better to not have a car. The transit system, everything else is so good. Ottawa's not there yet. And so I don't know if it's a viable strategy for you at this point. But I like the thought process. I think you can aspire to get to that point, right?
Yeah,
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a great question.
We have members at our downtown community association pushing for a congestion charge, and I have to say we are not there yet. It's going to be a while till Ottawa considers that.
Yeah.
All
It
right.
it is certainly not the low-hanging policy fruit, right? I mean, you look at New York, and New York, it has been a political bloodbath getting this thing approved. There's been so much fighting and anxiety and a lot of political capital spent on it. That's bizarre to me, because you go to New York and everybody walks, everybody's taking a train. Like, why is this not the most popular policy in the world? If you are in New York, to me, you would cheer this, like, get rid of all the cars. Just let me walk in the street. There's, in any one street at any one time, there's like 500 people walking in this much room on the edge, and then like 20 people in the traffic lane here. I have no idea why politically it's so hard to do this. In a place like Ottawa, where you don't have that dynamic, it will be even harder, right?
So part of the issue, and I believe New York had this problem, is it needed to be approved by the state, which is in upstate New York. And I know Ottawa would have that problem as well. It would need to be the province. All right, so we have time for one more question. Marco, let's make it quick.
Sweet.
Marco, round two.
Yeah, round two. We have an upcoming planning meeting at our city, and it's about development charges, and they're seeking to increase the development charges by, I think, about 30% for essentially what they use development charges for is like things like new roads, pipes, all that stuff. And I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts on what your thoughts are about development charge, like as a model in terms of like having an upfront cost that housing needs to pay to be built in the first place. And if you have any thoughts on how that interacts with like, fixing things like the housing crisis and stuff like that.
You all have asked such great questions. You really have. Marco, this is a fantastic question. I don't like development charges, not because I don't think they're justifiable or I don't think they're good, but I think what happens is that they tend to make our public delivery of services really lazy. Development charges are a great way to pay for the first life cycle. They're a great way to pay for the upfront costs of new development. When we don't do the math on that development, when we don't actually sit and do a return on investment kind of calculation, how much liability are we taking on versus how much tax base are we getting? What is the long-term viability of that tax base? What are the odds that we're going to be able to fix this road when it falls apart with the new tax base that we're bringing in? What is the odds that we're going to be able to repair the pipe that we're taking over when the pipe goes bad based on the number of new connections that we've had? When we don't do that math, what we wind up doing is we wind up taking over as a municipal corporation, as a city, as a collection of all of us as taxpayers, as residents, all this, the city, we wind up making really bad investments where we take over more and more stuff without enough tax base, without enough capacity to actually maintain that. Every time we grow in this way, we become poorer. When I look at the places that use development fees, exaction fees, upfront fees to help pay for major infrastructure, what happens is that the people internal to the system, the engineers, the planners, the others that covet this new development for a variety of logical reasons, they become lazy in their thinking and they stop looking at, is this a long-term good investment? And they shift their thinking to, can we finance this initial investment? And without that other discipline to look at the long term, impact fees, development fees up front, what I have found is they just make the problem worse. They allow you to grow faster. They allow you to do less solvent developments. They allow you to have less return on investment. They allow you to do such like dumber financial things because you have this pot of money you can access every time you do it. And so in an ideal world, you would have development charges, but you would pair them with a really rigorous return on investment analysis, and you would not take over any new developments that didn't cover their long-term maintenance costs. We don't have that. We don't do that. I don't think you do that. And because you don't do that, development charges are more than likely than not to just juice really bad development practices. And as logical as they may be in theory, in practice, that is a really bad outcome.
Thank you very much. I completely agree. A lot of the development charges we're going to be using is widening roads. And as you said, a lot of that tax base isn't going to be able to fund those road widenings in the long run. So completely agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I mean, that's what I see too, is that, Florida in the US is the state that is probably the most aggressive with exactions with development impact fees. And they just use it to go like build the next mile of Strode and then the new frontage roads and the new traffic signals and the new lift station. And then they go build the next increment of junky development and they're all going broke from it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so our next in-person event is going to be June 3rd at McNabb at 6:15 p.m. We're reading Feminist City by Leslie Kern. And I want to thank everyone for coming out and asking great questions. And I especially want to thank Chuck for giving us some great answers.
Thank you. I've been this deep in housing, and I actually haven't talked confessions, transportation in a few months. And so it was really cool when you guys said, let's do this. I'm like, oh, this is awesome. I love talking about this. So thank you for reading the book and having a deep conversation there. And thanks for hanging out. This is really fun. And I hope you keep being inquisitive and thinking these things through. I'm really proud of all you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. See you, folks.
Take care, everybody.